Kale Varen shivered as he stepped off the transport pod onto the frozen plains. The wind tore at his coat, biting through layers of fabric, yet he stood straight. He had been exiled from the human colonies for a mistake no one truly understood. Some said he had disobeyed orders. Others whispered he had saved lives at the cost of his career. Now no one awaited him. No one would remember him. The frontier world of Navara was barren, a planet almost forgotten, a place where storms never ended and silence lasted for weeks. Here, Kale was meant to guard a small energy site near the ice fields. The official report called it unimportant. Kale did not care. Duty had been all his life, and even exiled he would not abandon it. The first night was cruel. Snow fell in thick sheets, covering the metal platforms and freezing the water in his small supply tank. Kale had only a few rations, a thin sleeping mat and an old, battered energy rifle. The stars were distant points of cold fire in the sky, and he felt smaller than ever. He made a fire inside his temporary shelter, using a heat coil to melt snow for water. The storm outside raged, but inside he felt a small sense of control. He whispered to himself, "One day at a time. That is all I need." The second day brought strange sounds. At first, Kale thought it was the wind twisting around the mountains, but the noises repeated, low growls almost like breathing from deep inside the ice. He wrapped himself tighter in his coat and stepped toward the edge of the ice cliffs. There, he saw faint movements beneath a crack in the frozen surface. Curiosity mixed with caution. He bent down, pressing a gloved hand against the ice. The movement grew clearer, and he realized it was not rock or frost. Something alive was trapped beneath. Hours passed as Kale studied the shifting shapes. Finally, he noticed small, clawed figures struggling beneath the surface. They were young, but their shapes were unmistakable. Dragons. Thought extinct, thought legends. His first instinct was disbelief. Then he remembered his orders, guard the site. But what he saw felt like more than a duty, it felt like a responsibility he could not ignore. He dug cautiously with his hands and a small ice pick, breaking the frozen crust to reach them. The creatures stirred, fragile and weak, their eyes reflecting fear and confusion. Kale had never been close to dragons, only stories told by old colonists around fires. But he knew they needed help. Kale spent the next days moving between the small shelter and the ice fissure. He managed to create a warm area using spare heat coils, shielding the young dragons from the worst of the cold. He melted snow for them, shared small bits of his rations, and spoke softly, though they did not understand words. Every time the storm howled, he sat close, letting them feel his warmth. His hands grew raw, his fingers cracked from frostbite, but he refused to leave. For the first time in years, Kale felt that his isolation was not punishment, it was purpose. Alone on Navara, Kale also noticed other signs. Shadows that moved beneath the ice, shapes that seemed to watch from the distance. He understood that these young dragons were not the only ones. Somewhere, hidden in the deep layers of the planet, the elders slumbered. They sensed something unusual in the air, a human who stayed, a human who offered warmth instead of fire and steel. Kale did not know this, but he had already begun to make a connection that stretched beyond species, beyond fear and history. One evening, while Kale was repairing a heat coil, a sudden tremor shook the ice. The young dragons scrambled, tiny wings flapping against the cold air. Kale ran to the fissure, anchoring himself so he would not slip. The ice crack widened, revealing shapes he had never imagined, scales glittering beneath the frost, eyes half closed in sleep. These were not children anymore, they were creatures of ancient power. Kale could not speak. For a moment he was paralyzed by awe. Then instinct took over. He moved between the ice and the dragons, shielding them from falling ice, from the bite of wind. He stayed until the tremor ended, soaked and shivering but alive. That night, Kale wrote in his log, not about orders or reports, but about what he had learned. The dragons are real. They are alive. And they trust me somehow. For the first time, the exile felt meaningful. He realized that duty was more than following rules, it was standing for those who could not stand for themselves. In the darkness, he felt a quiet hope, fragile but certain, that maybe he had not been sent here to die alone, but to protect something worth remembering. Days turned into weeks. Kale's isolation became a rhythm of care and vigilance. He learned the patterns of the young dragons, their small quirks, the way they curled together to stay warm, the tiny huffs when they were frightened. The storms remained fierce, but he faced them without fear. On nights when the aurora danced across Navara's sky, he would sit at the edge of the ice, looking down at the nest. The stars above reflected in the dragon's eyes, and Kale felt, for the first time in his life, that he was part of something larger. He was a guardian, a human who had no one else to remember him, yet had found a duty no one could take away. He whispered promises to the nest, small vows of protection, never imagining that far away, beings older than time itself were beginning to sense the warmth he offered. Kale Varen, exiled and alone, had found a purpose at the edge of nowhere. The storms would continue. The galaxy might forget him. But the dragons had already begun to remember. Kale woke to the soft hiss of wind against the ice, the same sound that had haunted him for weeks. But today it was different. Beneath the frozen crust, he could hear small movements, a rhythm of life that made his chest tighten. The young dragons had survived the first storms, though they were weak and cold. Their tiny bodies shivered under the thin heat shields he had built, and Kale knew that without him, they would not last another day. He rubbed his hands together, ignoring the cracks of frost in his fingers, and approached the fissure. The dragons looked up at him with wide eyes, bright and strange in the dim light. Kale smiled, a small warmth spreading through him that had nothing to do with the heat coils. He had learned their habits quickly. One, the smallest of the group, liked to rest under his coat when he leaned close. Another, bolder and more curious, would tap at his gloves with tiny claws, testing the strength of his hands. Kale had no experience with dragons beyond stories, and most told of monsters that burned villages or flew with armies. These creatures were not monsters. They were fragile, alive, and dependent on him. And in a strange way, Kale felt a connection that went beyond duty. He began speaking to them softly, telling stories of worlds they could not yet know, of stars that shone in patterns across the sky. He was not sure they understood, but they listened, curling closer when his voice lowered and softening their anxious movements. Food was a constant problem. Kale's rations were small, just enough for himself if he ate sparingly. But he melted ice and ground it into a soft slurry, feeding it to the dragons carefully, one by one. He learned how to measure warmth, how long they could stay under a heat coil before the frost would touch them again. Nights were the hardest. The wind howled through the cliffs, and the shelter he had built shivered under its force. Kale sat with the dragons, pressing his palms against their small bodies, willing them to absorb what little warmth he could offer. Sometimes exhaustion overcame him and he would fall asleep half-crouched beside them, only to wake to a small hiss and a nudge, reminding him that they still needed him. Outside the fissure, Kale began noticing shadows. Not the usual swirls of snow, but darker shapes beneath the ice and snow. He could feel the presence of something greater watching. At first, he feared it, thinking of ancient stories where dragons were hunters and humans were prey. But the shadows never approached. They lingered, silent and distant, as if curious. Kale realized that the adults, the elder dragons, were aware of his presence. They had felt his warmth, his care for their young. And for some reason they did not judge him nor attack. Instead they waited. He did not know it yet, but a bond was forming, one that would stretch far beyond the frozen plains and the edge of human knowledge. Kale's own body began to weaken. The cold was relentless, the work never-ending. His gloves were cracked and bleeding, his boots frozen stiff. But every time he considered giving up, the dragons would stir, reaching tiny claws toward him or tilting their heads with cautious trust. It was not fear that held him here. It was responsibility, a feeling stronger than punishment or exile. He had failed at many things in the human world, but here he was needed. And in being needed, he found a sense of self that exile could never take away. One morning, a tremor ran through the ice, sharper and deeper than any he had felt. Kale ran to the fissure, heart pounding, and saw the young dragons huddled together, frightened by the shaking. As he approached, a small figure emerged through a crack in the ice, scales glittering faintly in the dim light. It was larger than the hatchlings, older but not as massive as the legends he had heard. Kale froze. The dragon raised its head, eyes glowing with something that seemed almost human in understanding. It sniffed the air, then turned to the young ones, nudging them gently. Kale realized the elder was neither threatening nor indifferent. It was watching, learning. And he understood that it was judging him, testing whether he could be trusted. For days Kale observed this pattern. The young dragons were learning too, flapping tentative wings, testing their strength. When he brought them warmth, the elder watched silently from the fissure's edge. He began leaving small scraps of food closer to the cracks, gently moving the youngest hatchlings toward safety when the wind blew too hard. Slowly he began to see a rhythm, a silent agreement forming between human and dragon. He was protector, they were dependent, and the elder, unseen yet present, was witness. Kale felt a pride he had not known in years, a joy that went beyond survival. Here, on a cold, forgotten planet, he had found a home in the small trust of creatures far older than humanity. One night, Kale could hear the ice shifting in the distance, a low rumble vibrating beneath his feet. He pressed his face against the frost-covered window of his shelter, watching the sky. The auroras shimmered in green and violet arcs, reflecting off the scales of the dragons that had begun peeking out of their nest. It was a rare moment of calm, a pause in the endless battle against cold and time. He whispered to the young dragons, telling them that tomorrow would bring another storm, but that he would be there. And he meant it. For the first time in his life, Kale felt that he was not simply surviving. He was standing for something greater, something timeless. His warmth was not just heat. It was care, presence, and a human promise that life mattered, even when the galaxy had turned away. Weeks passed. Kale had grown thin, his hands raw, but the dragons thrived. They learned to flap in small circles, testing gravity, and sometimes when he leaned close they would press against him, tiny bodies warm and soft. The elder remained distant but ever present, a silent guardian observing his dedication. Kale knew that his life, though small and forgotten by humans, had meaning here. In the cold he had given warmth. In isolation he had given trust. And in that trust he found a life that exile could not take away, a life that belonged not to a government, not to orders, not even to mistakes, but to the small, bright, living hearts that now depended on him. Kale Varen, exiled and alone, had built a world of warmth in a world of ice. And unknown to him, far above and below, beings older than time had begun to remember him, sensing a human who had chosen kindness when the galaxy had forgotten how. The cold never let up. Kale Varen had grown used to the wind biting his face, the snow blinding his eyes, and the endless gray horizon stretching in every direction. But today there was a sound he did not recognize. Far above the ice cliffs, a faint hum, metal scraping against ice, broke the silence. Kale's pulse quickened. He had been alone for weeks, guarding the energy site in the dragon nest, but now something was coming. He grabbed his energy rifle, checking the power cells, though he had no real plan to fight. He had survived storms and frost. Now he would survive for another reason: the dragons. From the edge of the cliffs, Kale could see them, small hovering ships approaching, sleek and gray, glinting in the weak sunlight. They did not belong to any human faction he recognized. Raiders. They were looking for the energy below the ice, but if they found the nest, everything would be lost. Kale's mind raced. He could not call for help. There were no friendly ships, no colonies within a light year. He was alone. But he had something no one expected. He had a reason to stand, a reason stronger than fear. These young dragons, fragile and new, depended on him. He would not let them die. Kale ran across the frozen plain, setting small traps he had scavenged from old equipment. Heat mines to deter landing, wire grids to trip the smallest walkers. He knew they would not be enough to stop an army, but they could slow them down by time. He positioned himself near the fissure, the dragons close by, huddled in the warmth he had built. He whispered to them, "Stay calm. Stay hidden. I will not let them hurt you." The young dragons pressed against him instinctively, sensing the danger. Kale's heart tightened. Every instinct in him screamed to survive. But more than survival, he knew he had to stand even if no one would ever see it. The raiders landed closer, their machines crunching through the ice. Kale could see them scanning the ground, unaware of the nest below. He took a deep breath and moved to a higher ridge, keeping a clear view. Every step was careful, calculated. He fired a warning shot into the air. The sound echoed across the ice. The raiders stopped, puzzled. Kale used the pause to activate more traps, hiding wires beneath thin frost, arranging reflective surfaces to confuse their sensors. He had no hope of defeating them in a fight, but he could buy the dragons moments of safety. That was enough. Time stretched in long, tense minutes. The wind blew harder and snow swirled, hiding the movement of the young dragons. Kale could see their tiny heads poking above the heat shields, their eyes wide and trusting. He could not fail. Not now. One of the raiders tried to move closer to the fissure, stepping on weak ice. Kale raised his rifle not to kill but to scare. A bright pulse of energy arced across the snow, and the raiders stumbled, yelling into the radio. Others hesitated, unsure of the sudden obstacles. Kale moved silently, setting more heat mines and adjusting the reflection panels to blind their sensors. He worked with speed, adrenaline pumping through him. Every decision mattered. Every small action could save the dragons' lives. Hours passed. Kale did not rest. The raiders circled, trying to find a way down to the fissure. But the traps worked. Machines slipped on the thin ice, sensors were misled by mirrors, and Kale's careful placement of small energy bursts kept them guessing. He never fired to harm, never wanted to. His stand was for protection, not destruction. Every time the wind tore through his clothing, he reminded himself why he stayed. The dragon's warmth, their fragile bodies pressed close to his, gave him strength. For the first time, Cale realized that bravery was not about fighting alone. It was about holding the line for those who could not hold it themselves. Night fell. The raiders were frustrated, unsure of how to proceed. Cale sat in the shadows, rifle ready, watching. He knew the ice could not hold them forever. He did not know how long he could continue, but he refused to move away from the nest. His hands were raw, his muscles burned, but the dragons slept close by, trusting him. He thought of his exile, of the worlds that had cast him out, of the humans who would never know he stood here alone. And he understood something powerful. A life mattered when it protected another. The galaxy might forget him, but the dragons would not. They sensed it even now, the quiet strength in the human who refused to leave. The raiders tried one last approach, moving quickly across a thin ice bridge. Cale stepped forward, letting loose a series of bright warning pulses. The machines skidded, grinding against frost, and one nearly fell into the fissure. Cale could have retreated, could have saved himself. But he did not. He held his position, leaning into the wind, a shield of warmth and presence for the young dragons. And then, as suddenly as it began, the machines withdrew. Perhaps frustrated, perhaps wary of the strange planet, the raiders left. Cale did not cheer. He only exhaled, exhausted, knowing he had held the stand alone, invisible to the rest of the galaxy. The dragons stirred, tiny huffs of sound, pressing closer to him in silent gratitude. Cale stayed with the nest that night. He did not sleep properly, only nodded off in short moments, always keeping one eye on the horizon. The aurora shimmered across the ice, reflecting in the scales of the young dragons. For the first time he felt a quiet pride, not in orders or medals, but in something far older and deeper. He had stood when no one watched, defended life when no one remembered his name, and kept hope alive where it had almost died. Exile had led him here, storms had tried to break him, and the galaxy had turned away, but he had kept the dragons safe. That was enough. That was everything. In the quiet of the night, Cale whispered to the dragons, "You are safe. I will not leave. I promise." They curled closer, tiny bodies warm against his own. Somewhere beneath the ice, he sensed movement, distant and powerful. The elders were watching, aware of the human who had chosen warmth over fear, protection over selfishness. Cale did not see them, but he felt their presence, a quiet acknowledgement that his stand had been noticed. He had stood alone, unseen by any human eyes, yet witnessed by beings older than the stars themselves. And in that moment he understood that legends were not always written by those who watched. They were made by those who dared to act. Cale Varen, exiled and alone, had taken a stand no one witnessed, and yet it mattered more than he could ever know. Years passed on Nivara, but Cale Varen's vigil never wavered. The storms remained constant, the cold unrelenting, and the planet seemed empty to anyone who did not look closely. Yet beneath the ice the dragons grew. The young ones Cale had saved had matured, flapping larger wings and breathing heat into the frozen caves. They remembered the warmth he had given them, the soft voice and steady hands that never left when danger came. Cale, now older, thinner and weathered, could feel their strength, the energy flowing through the nest. He still did not know how many elder dragons were watching, but he sensed them, distant and quiet, like shadows that understood everything. One night, a hum filled the sky, faint at first, then growing louder. Cale had heard similar sounds before, raiders or passing ships, but this was different. The air vibrated with a power that made the snow lift in waves. He ran to the edge of the cliffs and his eyes widened. Above the horizon, shapes moved in the aurora-lighted sky. Dragons. Not the small ones he had raised, but massive, magnificent creatures he had only ever imagined in old stories. Their scales reflected the shifting colors of Nivara's storms, eyes glowing with intelligence and memory. Cale could feel it deep in his chest. The elder dragons had arrived. They had remembered him. The sky darkened as the dragons circled above, and a deep, vibrating sound rolled across the plains. Cale dropped to his knees, awe rooting him in place. The young dragons, now larger and stronger, flapped beside him, their bodies pressing close in recognition. The elders did not attack, nor did they ignore. They were here for a purpose beyond human understanding. Cale realized that his actions, his warmth, his care had been noted. They were acknowledging him. And in that moment he understood something that had never been true for him before. Legends could be born from kindness and courage, even when no one else saw. Across the galaxy, signals began to change. Traders and explorers reported massive unidentified flying beings appearing over uninhabited planets. Some called them guardians, some called them dragons. Entire fleets paused in confusion when the creatures passed, sensing something in the air, a presence beyond threat. And always at the center of their formation, a pattern repeated, shapes that reflected Kale's insignia, preserved in the energy of dragon life itself. It was as if the dragons had learned to honor him, turning memory into a signal humans could feel but could not fully understand. The man who had been forgotten by his colonies was now known in the skies. Kale watched the dragons circle, small tears freezing on his face. He had not expected this. He had not thought the galaxy would ever know his name. Yet here it was, alive and pulsing in light and power. The dragons had made him part of their memory, part of their story, and they carried it far beyond the ice cliffs. For the first time in years, Kale felt a peace that no storm could destroy. He had not sought glory only to protect those who could not protect themselves. Now the galaxy itself remembered him, through creatures older than history, through beings who had the patience to wait decades for the right moment. Over the following weeks, Kale noticed patterns. The dragons moved with purpose, spreading across neighboring planets, often pausing near human settlements. They did not attack. They did not demand tribute. They watched. And wherever they appeared, humans reported small but meaningful changes. Crops grew faster, small animals survived harsher conditions, storms seemed less violent. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Kale knew the truth. The dragons were honoring him by protecting life, mirroring the way he had once protected them. He had stood alone, and the ripple of that stand had grown larger than he could have imagined. At night, Kale would sit beside the young dragons who had grown into strong adults. They still recognized him, curling against his legs, pressing heads against his chest. One, now the size of a small ship, leaned over him, nuzzling gently. Kale laughed quietly, a sound that mingled with the wind. "I never thought the galaxy would see me," he said softly. "And yet you did." The dragons did not answer, but their presence said more than words could. They had remembered the warmth of a human who did not abandon his duty, and in remembering, they had rewritten the story of his life. Kale began documenting everything in a new way. Not in reports for commanders who had exiled him, but in notes for anyone who might find them centuries later. He wrote of the young dragons, of the care and attention they needed, and of the trust that had grown between them and him. But more than anything, he wrote of the elders, of their silent judgment, and of the strange joy he felt when they finally revealed themselves. Legends, Kale realized, were not always written by humans. Sometimes, they were etched in memory by those who understood what it truly meant to stand for something, even when the rest of the world turned away. The sky continued to shimmer, and the dragons moved with a purpose beyond his understanding. Kale could feel the hum of their energy, a vibration that touched the core of the planet. He understood that the nest he had guarded so fiercely was no longer just a secret hiding under ice. It was a symbol, a beacon of human courage seen through dragon eyes. And though Kale had never asked for recognition, the galaxy could now not ignore the name of the man who had stood alone, who had chosen warmth in a world of ice. As the auroras danced across Navarra, Kale felt a quiet certainty. He had not lived for glory, and yet he had achieved something greater. His actions had echoed across time and space, remembered not in words or medals, but in the living memory of dragons. The sky itself seemed to hold his name, shimmering in green and violet light, as the elder dragons circled above and the younger ones flapped around him. Kale Varen, exiled, alone and forgotten by human colonies, had become a part of something eternal. That night, he lay beside the nest, exhausted but content. The dragons nestled close, their warmth surrounding him, and he whispered promises for the future. "I will stay," he said. "I will always stay." And the dragons answered in their own way, small vibrations and soft huffs, carrying a message that the galaxy would someday feel. The human who once guarded them alone was never truly gone. The sky remembered, the stars remembered, and the dragons, ancient and patient, had made him a legend. Kale Varen, who had stood when no one watched, had become remembered by the greatest beings the galaxy had ever known. His life of exile had ended in a quiet triumph, not for fame or glory but for warmth, courage, and the simple act of standing for what was right. The ice of Navarra had softened with time. Spring, rare and brief, spread across the plains in delicate waves, melting snow into small streams. Kale Varen, now older and thinner, walked carefully among the fissures where he had first discovered the dragons. He looked around and smiled softly. The young dragons he had protected years ago were no longer small, they were majestic, strong, and full of life. Their scales reflected the weak sunlight, glinting in shades of green, gold, and violet. They moved gracefully, flapping wings that could carry them across mountains, but they always returned to him. Kale felt a quiet pride, knowing that the warmth he had offered had given them strength, and that his choice to stay even in exile had mattered more than any award or honor he had ever sought. News from the stars had begun to reach him, carried by travelers and explorers. Stories of massive dragons appearing near distant colonies, hovering silently above human settlements, were spreading. Some humans called them guardians. Others called them legends. Kale had never sought recognition, yet he realized the creatures he had saved were now leaving traces of his presence across the galaxy. Their flight patterns, the way they glimmered in the sky, and the symbols they traced with their glowing energy were all forms of memory. Somewhere, far beyond Nivara, humans were beginning to know his name not through words, but through the living imprint of his courage. Kale's days were now filled with quiet joy. He worked with the dragons, tending the nest and teaching them small things he had learned about survival. Some of the young dragons were curious about human tools, nudging him with snouts and peering into his belongings. Kale laughed more often now, a rare sound that mixed with the wind and the distant echo of their wings. He had once been a warrior, exiled and forgotten. Now he was a guardian, a teacher, and a friend to beings older than human history itself. Each dragon carried a part of him in their memory, a reflection of the warmth he had shown, the courage he had offered, and the choices he had made when no one watched. One evening, the sky shimmered with an unusual light. The elder dragons had gathered above, forming a vast circle. Their scales glowed, casting faint reflections on the ice below. Kale felt a vibration through the ground, subtle yet powerful, as if the planet itself was acknowledging him. He knelt beside the nest, pressing his hands against the scales of the young dragons who had grown alongside him. He whispered softly, "We are part of something greater. You remember and I remember. And together we carry it forward." The dragons stirred, small huffs and vibrations answering him. It was a language older than words, one Kale had learned to understand through years of patience and care. The legend of Kale Varen spread slowly, carried in the quiet way of those who notice wonders without rushing. Explorers and traders spoke of dragons protecting human settlements, leaving symbols that hinted at a guardian human they had never met. Scientists tried to study the dragons but could not capture their full purpose. Some began to understand that these were not mere creatures. They were living memories of kindness, courage, and protection. Kale's name became known in stories and whispers, though he himself remained on Nivara, tending the nest and observing the stars. He had never sought fame, yet fame had found him in the most unexpected way. Over the following months, Kale noticed changes on Nivara itself. The ice melted faster in some areas, plants began to grow in patches where once only snow had existed, and small animals returned to the planet. The dragons had spread life, in their own quiet way, across the land he had watched over for so long. Kale realized that his small acts of warmth had created ripples, extending beyond the dragons, beyond the ice, beyond even the memory of humans. He had stood alone, protected life when no one watched, and in doing so, had begun a story that would last far longer than any human record could capture. At night, Kale often walked to the edge of the cliffs, watching the dragons soar under the auroras. He traced their glowing paths with his eyes, seeing the patterns they formed in the sky. Each shape told a story. The first night he had discovered the hatchlings, the storms he had endured, the moments of care and patience, the choices to stay when leaving would have been easier. The sky itself had become a record of his life, written not in words but in light, energy, and memory. He realized that legends were not always made by battles won or empires built. Sometimes, legends were made by the quiet, steadfast acts of a single heart that chose warmth over fear, protection over indifference. One day, a small group of humans arrived, explorers seeking the energy sites and the rumored dragons. They froze at the sight of the creatures, massive and glowing, yet calm, hovering silently above the ice. Kale stepped forward, no longer the exiled warrior who had arrived years ago, but a guardian whose presence commanded respect. He spoke softly, explaining nothing and everything, showing patience, care, and understanding. The humans were awed, but they could sense the truth without explanation, that this human had stood alone, had protected life, and had been remembered by beings far older and wiser than themselves. Kale did not ask for their approval. It was not needed. The dragon's memory was all the recognition he required. Years rolled by and Kale aged. His hair grew silver, his body thinner and slower, yet he never left the nest. The dragons, now strong and majestic, circled the planet with purpose, teaching younger dragons and visiting distant worlds. They carried his story, their actions echoing the choices he had made decades before. Wherever they appeared, humans felt a quiet reverence, and life often prospered in small, subtle ways. Kale had become more than a man. He had become a memory alive in the skies, a symbol of courage, warmth, and the quiet strength of humanity. One night, under the auroras, Kale lay beside the nest, the cold softened by dragon warmth. He gazed at the stars and whispered a promise, not for himself, but for the generations of dragons and humans to come. "I will always stand. I will always care. And you will remember." The dragons responded with soft huffs and gentle nudges, their presence a living testament to his words. Far across the galaxy, the sky itself seemed to shimmer, carrying the light of the legend he had become. Kale Varen, once exiled and alone, had become eternal, not through battles or medals but through warmth, courage, and the enduring act of standing for what mattered. The humans who came after would see the traces, hear the stories, and look to the skies in wonder. The dragons would not forget, and neither would the universe. Kale Varen's legend was written not on paper or in stone, but in stars, in life, and in the hearts of those he had touched. He had stood alone, but in doing so he had changed the galaxy forever.